A lot of anxious people in here ready to learn some more. I can see it all over your faces. You just want the next session to start. Just want to take a moment again to thank our sponsors, all of the sponsors that sponsored this event. Just thank you so much. Today's second break this afternoon with Total Law. George will be here later on today, so you can thank him when you see him tomorrow. This next panel, it's got some great information, strategies. I mean, in today's world, in today's import-export environment, we're always looking for the best strategy for our clients, for our importer, exporter. I mean, whatever it is that you are, whether you're the importer or exporter, you're looking for the best strategy to minimize the cost of the movement of transaction and to do it as efficiently as possible. This next panel is going to talk all about strategies and things that aren't just the normal import and export transaction, but some nuances that you can take advantage of. So with that, I do have on the panel Amanda Barlow from Roanoke Trade, Robert Stein from Mohawk Global Trade Advisors, and Jason Weiselman from International Bond and Marine. And again, they've got some great information to share with you on some potential ways to save yourself some money and make things a little smoother for yourself. So with that, I'm going to pass it over.
So thank you everyone for coming. We knew everybody would be really interested in this. This is a really timely topic, but really much more important is I just need to know by a show of hands who here had the pretzel at the break, right? Good. All right, if you're sitting next to someone with their hand up, you may have to poke them halfway through because they're going to be carb crashing, okay? So thank you for all the other people who didn't have one who are going to help us out. All right, so when we thought about doing this, we thought people are going to come here, and you've heard a lot of stuff, and there's been lots of talk about things like trade war and a lot of backward looking and how we got here. And we thought we really wanted to be forward looking, right? If this is a strategy session, we shouldn't be looking at history. We should be looking forward. So, and there we go. Whoops, too far. Come on. All right. So we wanted to start off with questions, because we thought these are the kinds of questions that everybody would have coming in here to talk about, well, what am I going to do? And I know we have brokers and forwarders, we have importers, we have exporters. And so the questions are maybe slightly different depending on your role, but these are all the same questions. These are the questions about how do I plan, right? If I'm an importer, if I'm an exporter, what can I do to mitigate risk and move my business forward? If I'm a broker and a forwarder, how do I service my importers and exporters so that they appreciate what I'm bringing to them as good strategy? So we wanted to sort of address these kinds of questions. I'm not going to go through them, and we're not going to answer them now. We just thought these were the questions that you might have. And you're going to have plenty more, I'm guessing, at the end. So our plan is to leave about 15 minutes at the end so people can address questions to us, and we'd be glad to answer them. To start off with, just wanted to go over some of the stuff, and I know this morning there was a great session with Adrian Braumiller and Sue Ross and Jay, and they talked a lot about trade remedies. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but just to sort of recap, with Section 301, I'm not going to go into this stuff here because, again, some of this stuff has been recapped, and I know there's more stuff coming up later on today on a few of the things we're going to talk about. But we still want to refresh. Some of you may not have been in the session this morning, and some of you may have been unable to attend. Maybe you slept through it. No, I don't think you would have done that. It was a really good presentation, and Sue talked extensively about this, so there's nothing here that I don't think she didn't talk about. But basically, the Section 301, this was related to a proclamation related to intellectual property and forced technology transfer. And the big deal, of course, is all about the tariff overview. I'm one slide ahead here. So originally, we had the 25% on List 1, List 2. Those went into effect. We'll talk a little bit about exclusions further on. And then List 3, which we all now know there's an exclusion process for now that it's at 25%. And of course, the most important one, List 4. This clicker is like a lesson in suspense. I push it and I wait and see what happens. All right. All right, so List 4, and we're going to talk a little bit about this because this comes under the category of sort of strategy, right? You know, List 4 and what's going to happen. So we are going to talk a little bit about that as well. The important thing to remember is that it's currently suspended, right? This list 4 is currently suspended pursuant to the conversation that President Trump had with Xi Jinping at the G20 summit. Now, I was in the session this morning when Sue Ross asked questions about those of you and how long you think this situation with China was going to last. And suffice it to say that if I am to follow the raising or not raising of hands, it's a pretty good bet that most of you believe that we're going to see list 4. So we'll talk more about that later. Real brief on section 232, and again, this was covered this morning, but these are your 25% tariffs on steel and your 10% tariffs on aluminum. And this is all part of this new trade era. It all started with 232, then 301. You may have been reading the news and saw news about a possible European tariff. We had a big scare with a possible Mexican tariff related to immigration. And again, as part of the new trade era, one of the things we're going to talk about is uncertainty and the kinds of things that may be coming and how you can prepare for it. So what we want to do is have kind of like a panel discussion. We're going to all talk together. This is not, each of us covering a bunch of slides and then handing off. We want to have a discussion. We want to give you our feedback together, the product, our experience and our knowledge, and some of this is opinion, right? Nobody really knows what's going to happen. So we're going to sit up here and we're going to say what we believe is going to happen and how you should prepare. There are others who may have a little different bent on it. And also there's a point where we're going to talk a little bit about how we feel about what's going to happen in the future. And I promise you, unstaged, we have not discussed our opinions beforehand. So this could be pretty exciting, okay? All right, so the considerations we want to look at. First, we're going to talk about monitoring your bond sufficiency. And Jason, I know you have a lot to say about that, and we're going to talk about that in greater detail later on. But that's a big thing that you want to consider, and it's something that is definitely, if it's not affecting your business, it will be. So I know Jason's going to do a great job of covering that in depth. In terms of product exclusions, and again, this is after the session this morning, but in case you missed it, product exclusions for lists 1 and 2 on section 301, they're closed. But list 3, that opened up in, I think, beginning of July, was it? And it's through September 30th is the end of the exclusion period. So one of the things that Sue said, or I think it was Adrian Brownmill actually said that you should apply sooner rather than later. And we're going to talk about that, but I definitely agree that if you're going to apply for a list 3 exclusion, that you should do it sooner rather than later. For all the reasons she cited, mostly the big one being the sooner you apply, the sooner you'll get a decision. You want to review exclusion determinations, and this is a big one. This is one that's tough for brokers. Those of you, how many of you are brokers or forwarders in the room, right? This is a tough one, right? When importers come to you and they say, hey, is my stuff covered in this exclusion? And those exclusion lists are pretty extensive. And the tough part is the unconditional exclusions are easy, right? Just HTS code. But those conditional ones require you to do a deeper dive. And more of the exclusions are conditional. So this is a big part of your strategy, taking into consideration exclusions. Considering alternative sourcing, we're going to talk a little bit about that. And of course, the heavy hitter to my right here is going to talk about ATA Carnet, which many of you may or may not have considered, but is another great strategy depending on what you're doing. Foreign trade zone, another way to mitigate or in some cases eliminate the impacts of some of these new tariffs. Tariff engineering, and again, I believe Sue Ross covered this and she did a fantastic job, and so I have a few thoughts to add to that. And also retaliatory tariffs on exports. And this is a big thing, so I don't know how many people here are exporters or forwarders who deal with exporters, but important to remember that a big part of this is not just about dealing with what's coming in, but also with what's going out. So I would dare say that everybody who's sitting in the room has some skin in the game, either as an importer, an exporter, or a customs broker, freight forwarder. Would that be a fair assumption? You can just nod. Hey, everybody's still awake. Excellent. Fantastic. All right, so with that, I know that as we talk about these different strategies, we have different expertise, and Amanda is really, I think inventing the Carnet might be a much, but you probably improved it, right? at least. So Amanda is the most knowledgeable carnet person, and these days, I mean, typically it's hard to get people to use carnets, but it's such a great tool, and it's especially a great tool now as we move forward.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Despite the accusations that I was around after Second World War when carnet was created, I have not. It's good skincare. I did not invent the carnet. It is an international convention. It's a WTO convention, the World Customs Organization Convention, that was created after Second World War to help rebuild war-torn Europe. So what is an ATA carnet? It's a cargo's passport. It's just like your personal passport, but for commercial goods. It's an international development tool, and that's very key in this new era that we're trading in. It helps businesses expand in new markets. It is an international customs document, and that's probably one of the most important parts because it's the only type of customs document of its type that is a harmonized, standard customs document across 77 customs administrations where it's accepted. Which also means any erroneous information on the ATA carnet or any erroneous use of the ATA carnet, and in this new era we're trading in, I have received some rather creative requests on how to use a carnet, and I'll get to some examples later. So any erroneous information on the carnet can constitute fraud to not only CBP, but potentially 77 other customs administrations. So it is a very serious document. What does it do? It allows temporary entry of items, duty-free and tax-free, whether shipped or hand-carried. So temporary means 1 year. Carnet is good for goods to go into a foreign country on a temporary basis, duty-free, tax-free, for 1 year. Now, those of you who have seen my presentation before know that there's always exceptions to every rule. And if you'd like to ask those questions, if anybody has the question about extending a carnet, we can do that in the Q&A section. I'm happy to answer those questions. So temporary, 1 year, not longer. Duty-free and tax-free is also important to note because while we focus on duties, most of our trading partners have import taxes. And every free trade agreement that the US participates in today is only duty-free, not tax-free. So I get, again, that question. Well, why? I'm going to a free trade agreement member country. Why would I need to use a carnet? I already qualify for duty-free. Well, did you realize that going to Mexico, you have a 16% import tax? So you can use the carnet to waive that tax as well. Shipped or hand-carried. That is also the reason the carnet is so dynamic. You can obtain your carnet from your customs broker freight forwarder, and they can ship it, handle everything for you door to door. Or you can obtain the carnet from your broker and forwarder, and then you can take it if you're a salesperson who wants to take your tools. We have one client who measures the pressure in bolts from everything in iPhones to actual turbines. And it's a tiny device. It's like this big. He obviously carries it with him everywhere he goes around the world to test the pressure of these bolts. He does it on ATA carnet, and he can do that by traveling on airline and declaring it when he gets the importing country on the carnet. As I mentioned before, it's established by the WCO, World Customs Organization's International Convention, that was created after Second World War. So, perfect. We're on time here. Why is ATA carnet good for your business? Right now, it is more important for your business than before because if you're a US exporter, and we're all talking about Section 301, Section 232, what you're not talking about is retaliatory taxes on US goods exported into foreign markets. So let's look at those. You got European Union, you're looking at sailboats and yachts. We actually export a significant amount of sailboats and yachts, or even just our racing teams that are going overseas to race are now being exposed if they go to Europe, where a lot of the yachting competitions happen, looking at 25%. China, artwork. I now get calls from certain brokers who specialize in the art forwarding industry because before they used to say, oh, Amanda, big museums, they don't need to use ATA carnet. Artwork is duty-free pretty much everywhere. Well, we do a lot of art shows in China, a lot of all the big name museums, all the big name galleries, and now they're exposed to suddenly 10%. When you're talking millions of dollars of artwork going in, 10% is not something you want to wake up with one day and saying, now my art exhibition is going to cost me 10% of the value of the shipment. It makes a huge difference. Those examples, that company is using carnets way more aggressively now. India, motorcycles, another big export, 50%. Japan, Russia, Turkey, anywhere from 5 to 140% retaliatory taxes. What about Section 301 and 232 coming into the United States? What about shipments coming in? Can you use a carnet for those? If they qualify. So we have a client that is working on a project to import petroleum exploration equipment. The equipment is coming in from Mexico. However, it's of Chinese origin. It will come into the US for the project, by a couple, 4 or 5 months project, and then it's going to be re-exported. Before, they never considered using a carnet because it's, no duties to come into the US, no problem, but it's Chinese origin because it would come in temporarily. So now they've decided that it's much better, even though it's coming in from Mexico, that they're actually going to use the ATA carnet, and they won't be exposed to Section 301 duties on that specific product from China. Aside from waiving the duties and taxes, the ATA carnet also eliminates posting of a temporary importation under bond or another form of financial guarantee to guarantee those duties. So when entering into a current country on a temporary basis, while the goods are going in and coming out, we all know customs, whether US or foreign, will never take a word or promise that they're going to come in and they're definitely going out. They need a guarantee to prove that what's going in is coming out. So there are a variety of options. Temporary importation under bond obviously is a common option, we all know, but not every country has temporary importation under bond as an option. So you have to post the duties and taxes in advance and hope to get refunded in a relatively timely enough manner and be exposed to foreign currency fluctuation and so on and so forth. So the carnet waives all of that guarantee that has to be posted. The carnet itself is that financial guarantee. It also replaces transit and bond in the event that you're transiting through countries to get to a final destination. It is one customs document for all customs transactions. What that means, it takes care of export registration out of the United States, importation documentation to the foreign country, re-exportation documentation from that country. Let's say there's a second or third country, so importation, re-exportation, and finally returning American goods or returning to the United States entry documentation, all in one simple package, just like a passport. But keep in mind, the ATA carnet only replaces the documentation to do with duty and tax assessment, does not replace any of the participating government agency requirements. So ITAR, BIS, CITES, Fish and Wildlife, Department of Agriculture, Food and Drug Administration. If any of the items you're shipping do qualify for PGA requirements, whether it's in the US or the equivalent overseas, they still have to obtain those licenses in addition to the ATA carnet. For ITAR, it's DSB 73, which goes along with the carnet. It's temporary export, re-import. And for CITES, there's a specific carnet license that's actually stamped physically into the carnet document. And CITES, for those of you who are not familiar, is the Convention in International Trade of Endangered Species. So if you're in apparel industry, you have a tuft of fur, mother of pearl, red coral, any type of alligators, stingray. It all depends on the animal and depends on whether it requires. If it requires CITES, then they need to obtain a CITES license in addition to the carnet. And I know fashion designers are very, very last minute, and CITES licenses can take up to 3 weeks, so they have to be planned and organized and not just decide to throw in a last minute feathered boa into a carnet shipment, which happens. So the ATA carnet allows unlimited entries and departures for up to 1 year. So if you have a client who lives, let's say, on the northern border, and they take their samples in over the border on a regular basis to make sales calls, that's perfect. They can use one carnet as often as they want within that year period. Another example is we have US manufacturers on the southern border who have specific parts that go into Mexico, into the maquiladoras, to build a specific item depending on the sales contract. They'll use a carnet for those parts. They don't want to keep them there all the time because the output of the product has to be dependent on the contract signed with their buyer. It minimizes language problems. Arrangements are made in advance in American English and paid in US dollars. So what type of goods qualify for ATA carnet? Basically, everything and anything qualifies for ATA carnet as long as it's intended for professional purposes, it's going in and coming out, and it falls into one of these 3 categories. These are very broad categories within the language of the convention. So commercial samples, goods used to generate a sales order, not for sale, but to generate the sales order. If anybody would like to ask me how to handle a sale of an ATA carnet, it's a breach, you can ask me in the Q&A section. I'm happy to answer in great detail. Professional equipment, tools of the trade, mining equipment, camera equipment, anything that has to go overseas to work on a project, the petroleum exploration equipment, for example. And finally, goods for exhibitions and fairs and similar cultural events. So any type of demonstration, any type of presentation covers on the ATA Carnet. Here's a couple examples of Carnet shipments. Are we getting there? All right, the suspense, you gotta wait for the photos. It really is suspenseful. Carnet is awesome, isn't it? All right, ta-da, these are our Carnet shipments. So medical devices, for example, going to CMEF in China to the medical trade show there, worth $1 million. You have offshore oil rig repair equipment going to the Gulf of Mexico or off the coast of Russia. Have mining equipment going into Canada for a mining project worth $2.5 million, and a rock band touring Europe with $4.3 million worth of musical equipment. All of these are actual ATA Carnet examples.
So just to pose the question to you, because, for example, people come to me and probably to folks out there, and they say, well, you know, we send stuff back and forth, and Canada's a very common one. They say, I send stuff back and forth to Canada all the time. There's trade shows, and we have a trade show, either truck or booth, and we go there like 3 times a year to the same 3 shows all the time. And we never really thought about Carnet. But is that something that they should be talking to you about, and is that something you're seeing a lot more of now?
Yes, absolutely. We're seeing that a lot. We're getting questions a lot of how they can use Carnets. And in the case of Canada, while we know it's a lot cheaper to go into Canada one time on a temporary import bond into Canada versus a Carnet, but as soon as you have a second or third or fourth trip into Canada, the Carnet is way more cost efficient because it's a one-time fee at the initial application of the Carnet. But let's get to, more importantly, what goods are not covered. Actually, go back one. Thank you. What goods are not covered on the ATA Carnet? Giveaways, food items, plants, consumables, disposable items, anything that's going through the postal traffic. So you have to ship this with a forwarder and have a customs broker handle the customs clearance. And personal cars for touring on the open road. So cars that are going to go and sit on a showroom floor and look pretty, or go to a big auto show, say the Javits Center Auto Exhibition in New York, or cars that are going to be in a closed racetrack environment like the Long Beach Grand Prix or Formula One, cars that are going to be used for hot weather testing, cold weather testing, any of those type of professional examples can absolutely go on an ATA Carnet. They just cannot be driven on the open road with the regular stream of public traffic. So as long as it's closed, so we do TV commercials and movies are filmed, they put a police barricade up, well now it's a private space, absolutely qualifies for ATA Carnet. No substantial transformation. Now in this new world, with all the tariffs, this is probably where I get the most common question. Amanda, I have a situation. I'm bringing in widgets, I'm putting it in a piece of equipment. The equipment is going for exportation. Technically, that widget's being re-exported. Can I use Carnet to not have to do the 301, Section 301 duties? No, because it's substantial transformation. So what goes in on Carnet must come out in the exact same manner. No further processing, no change in value, no tariff shift can happen to the goods while they're on an ATA Carnet. Which brings me to no repairs, no replacements. So let's say you have a piece of equipment that's in a hospital in Russia, in Moscow. The medical device breaks and has to be returned to be repaired and possibly have replacement parts. It cannot come into the US on a Russian Carnet. It has to come into the United States and then file for what is the value in the repair or replacement with CBP. So where can ATA Carnets be used? A lot of places, most of the world. As you can see, everything in Carnet Orange is Carnet friendly. It's 100 customs territories. Now you probably hear a lot of numbers out there, 100 customs territories, 77 countries. There's a total of 77 signatory countries to the ATA Carnet Convention. However, some of those countries administer customs in other territories. For example, France covers Monaco, French side of St. Martin. South Africa covers Namibia, Lesotho, Botswana, and Swaziland. Spain covers Canary Islands. So we go to a total of 100 customs territories where ATA Carnets are accepted. Anything in gray, we're working on, I promise you. So how does an ATA Carnet work? It sounds great, it sounds like a wonderful option. It's really easy. Very similar to your passport, it's a color-coded document, And each color represents a specific part in the customs transaction. So in conclusion, the ATA Carnet is a simple-to-use cost savings tool for your international business expansion, especially in this new era of trade.
All right, that's really great. And it's really interesting because Carnet, we always try to push it. It's a great tool. And a lot of companies have said, you know, we don't want to go through all that trouble, which, by the way, it's not any trouble to get a Carnet, right, Amanda? That is very true. So it's actually very easy, but it's something that companies, whether it's importers, exporters, and brokers and forwarders who should be looking at it for their clients, we should be considering, because it is a great strategy. And of course, this is one of several strategies we're going to cover, and it only covers specific things, but you should be aware of it, and you shouldn't be afraid of it, because especially now, because of the amount of duties and taxes that we're talking about, it really makes a lot of sense. So that is a great opportunity. So when we move then to another strategy, and we're going to talk about tariff engineering, and I know this came up earlier today, and tariff engineering has become really useful because, well, first of all, people are looking more closely at HTS codes. But then under tariff engineering, this is not something where we just make something up and say, well, you know, we're going to just do this little tiny thing and we're going to reclassify it. Tariff engineering is specifically changing your product and or process to alter the essential character or use of the goods. So there has to be, again, we talk about a substantial transformation. So it could be changing something so that you don't manufacture it as far into the production, so it has a different classification, or it could be even further manufacturing it. It could be making changes to what you're bringing in so that it's now a different product. So these are things that can all be done, and the idea is to utilize tariff engineering to say there are ways to change the classification legitimately so that we can bypass the duties that we would otherwise have to pay. So things like years ago when there still is a lot of anti-dumping duty on ball bearings, and a company was bringing in ball bearings and drawer slides, and they were getting hit with anti-dumping duties, and we said, why don't you combine the ball bearings and the drawer slides and make a completed drawer slide? And now that's not subject to the anti-dumping duty. So this is the same kind of tariff engineering where you can change the state of the goods that you're bringing in. And it requires sitting down and really looking at it, but this is a great way. And if you're an importer, it's something you should be doing. And if you're a broker, it's something that you should be talking to your importers and saying, you know, maybe there's a way we can change this product. Have you thought about ways to modify this so that we have a different classification? Now remember, we have to use caution because we don't want to just reclassify the goods, all right? So that's the first thing. But also remember that if in the process of looking at your HTS codes you found that you do have an incorrect classification, just again, you still want to use caution because you're going to have to reclassify if things were incorrectly classified. But that might still lead to a prior disclosure. And a good example was recently we had somebody who went through when they got hit with 25% on one of the lists, and they said, oh, wait a second, this is misclassified. It should be this other tariff classification that's 5% duty. Well, they had been coming in duty-free. So now they had to go back 5 years and basically reclassify and repay the 5% duty plus the interest on all the goods that had come in previously. So it was like a win. Yay, we don't have to pay 25%. Oh, man, we got to pay 5% going back 5 years. So these are the kinds of unintended consequences you can face. But remember, we're thinking forward, which is always making sure that you're strategizing for the best savings in the future. Maybe paying off 5% going back 5 years is expensive, but depending on how long this whole trade situation goes, it could be a heck of a lot cheaper than paying 25% going forward. Okay. Also, don't forget, it's based on condition at time of importation, and your tariff re-engineering should be legitimate. When you hear people say things like, well, what if we just change this? Will that be enough to reclassify it? Just be careful, because remember, tariff engineering is a serious, real thing if it's done legitimately. And it can and should be used for exports. Because remember, you were talking about this where on the Carnet, you're trying to help avoid tariffs overseas. Well, it's the same thing. When you're shipping outbound, that HTS classification of your goods can determine whether or not the buyer overseas is paying the duty. Chances are you're not shipping on a DDP basis, but your buyer will be very appreciative if it turns out you can engineer your product so that it no longer faces a retaliatory tariff.
I just wanted to make one comment about that. When you're talking about tariff engineering, if you're an importer, you're looking to your broker, he's your customs broker, and he's your consultant in a way. But it's important to, when you're talking about the size of these duties and stuff like that, and the levels that these are going to document your files and document these conversations that you're having with your importers too, because if something goes wrong, I'm an insurance broker, but if something goes wrong, you want to have these things in writing because we're talking about big dollars in these duty payments.
Absolutely. Good point. So beyond tariff engineering and carnet, eventually we will have on the screen FTZs. So a foreign trade zone, okay, or sometimes overseas they like to call these free trade zones, so we'll talk about that as well. Foreign trade zone benefits are really about duty avoidance and reduction. Now, the question that I get, because I do a lot of foreign trade zone consulting, so the question I get, people will call me, and I love the point where Sue Ross talked about wasted half-hour conversations, because this is the road I'm about to go down. Somebody calls up and says, hey, I don't want to pay any of those duties on Chinese goods. Can you set up a foreign trade zone for me so I don't have to pay them? Not exactly, okay? So what exactly on a foreign trade zone? What are the kinds of things, the benefits that you can get? Well, you can export goods from a foreign trade zone under bond, so goods coming into the foreign trade zone. So if you or one of your clients is someone who does a lot of exportation of goods, you can get a direct benefit because you don't pay the duty on those goods that you export. So they never enter the commerce of the U.S., and that's the key advantage of the FTZ. These are goods that never enter the commerce of the U.S. If you can move them out of the zone in bond to another country, you never pay the duty. You also have things like waste and scrap. Oh, this clicker is going to drive me crazy. Where's this thing made? No. So waste and scrap materials from foreign trade zone productions, people who do production and have a lot of waste and scrap. There's an opportunity there to avoid duty on those materials. So again, that's part of the FTZ benefit. You have duty inversion through production, although this has gotten tricky with the 301 proclamation because of the way it's written. I'm not going to get into that because we'd probably spend about an hour just talking about that. But the idea generally with duty inversion is if you have a foreign trade zone and you bring in components at a higher duty rate, you can actually pull them out of the zone after production at the lower duty rate of the finished good. Or conversely, if you have some components that actually have a lower duty rate than the finished goods, you can leave the duty rate as the component rate. So essentially, with a foreign trade zone, if you have production authority, you really get to choose which duty rate you'd like to use. And of course, you're going to choose the best one. And again, there's some complications here because of 301. So if you have goods that are subject to 301, you no longer get to choose the status, the foreign status of your goods. The components have to go in under what they call privileged foreign, and that changes a little bit the calculation. But there's still duty inversion benefits, and there's merchandise processing fee savings. So the maximum MPF on an entry is, who knows this? Wow, that was a pretty good answer, 508, right? So that's the new and improved MPF, and you pay the maximum at 0.3464% until you hit 508, right? If you do individual entries, you'll keep paying. Let's say you have high value goods. You could pay 508 on every entry. But if you use a foreign trade zone, you can use something called weekly entry. And I'm working on a zone in Ohio right now. They have 3,000 entry transactions a year, and they pay approximately $600,000 in MPF a year. Weekly entry is going to save them over $550,000 a year. So you have that in a foreign trade zone. And very importantly, very slowly, I feel like I'm in the Heinz commercial. Anticipate. There we go. Section 301 and 232 duty savings. So in this case, you can defer or avoid Section 232 or Section 301 duties entirely because, remember, those goods that you export from an FTZ, you never have to pay them. They never enter the commerce of the U.S. So this is a very common question. I get people who say, hey, I import all these goods, and about 30% of my goods stay in the U.S., and the other 70% I export. Do I have to pay the Section 301 duties? The answer is no. Okay? Now, when you get into production, it's the same thing. If you make goods, so remember I talked about how Section 301 locks that foreign status at privileged foreign, you might think, oh, I'm going to lose my duty inversion benefit. But if you manufacture those goods and then you export them, you don't pay those duties. So when it comes to foreign trade zone, it's an effective strategy. Now, it's not something you can just do and say, hey, I got an extra $50, can you set up an FTZ? It requires an investment of time and money. And so an evaluation has to be done of what are my potential savings. You can see I listed a few of the benefits. You have to go through and see, are all these benefits and the benefit of the savings on 232 and 301, are they going to be worth the investment? So these are things. A lot of companies 2 years ago said, I don't want to do that, that's too much work. And several of those companies have come back because they've said, well, we thought this whole trade thing was going to blow over in like a year. And it hasn't. So now they're very interested in talking about foreign trade zone. It's not for everyone, but it is a great strategy. So here we are at the unpredictable. And this is where I want to talk a little bit with Amanda and Jason about what the new normal is. I would say it's pretty fair at this point, in my opinion, that the new normal is unpredictability, right? A couple of years ago, you would say, I could plan my supply chain. I could advise my import or my export client. I knew what trade policy would be. I kind of knew what the duty rate was without checking Twitter, okay? I knew what the duty rate would be on Friday the week before. So I think at this point, there was a while where it was sort of a shock to the system, right? Everybody's like, oh my God, how can I do business this way? Well, it's not fun, right? I'm not here to tell you this is great, like this. Some people go, this is a new opportunity. Well, in some ways it is, but I'm not going to sell it like it's some golden opportunity. It's something we all have to face, right? Whether you're an importer, exporter, broker, forwarder, this is something we have to deal with, right? So unpredictable is the new normal. And so in that vein, I kind of wanted to ask each of you your opinion on rolling back the Section 301 tariffs and where you thought it might be going in terms of how long will these be in effect. And I don't know, maybe we could get a fourth opinion too. What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, I think it might be time for the mystery guest.
Mystery guest, okay. So, mystery guest. Mystery guest that incidentally dwells on my desk as my trade policy predictor. What are the chances these Section 301 tariffs will be rolled back this year?
It's decidedly so.
Oh! So if
Wait, there's a tweet too. No, there's no tweet.
So that's if it happens, you heard it here first. And once again, the magic 8 ball will have been correct. But in all seriousness, Jason, where do you think this is headed? How do you feel about it?
In my humble opinion, I think the requests from our side on the fundamental change to China's legal approach to the way they do business is going to be ultimately what holds things up. I think we'll see some minor give and take over the coming months, a little here, a little there, agricultural purchases, fluctuation, stuff like that. But any major changes, I think what we're asking for are fundamental changes in China that I just think that the government and the business sector there, it's just going to be too much. It's too paradigm shift for any meaningful change. I think they're going to wait. China's going to wait it out till the election, and we're going to be seeing and living in this new norm for a while longer. I also read the Wall Street Journal on the way in, so that's pretty much what they said.
I thought you were going to say you stayed at Holiday Inn Express. So Amanda, what do you think? How do you feel about in terms of how long this is going to go on, or maybe even some thoughts on what could cause these duties to eventually be rolled back?
Well, I was going to make another Twitter joke, but I think that we've definitely played it out. But sadly, that is the new reality we're living in. Twitter seems to be the place we get all of our news and all the changes directly impacting our business. And it's made our industry quite a household name. People know what we do now, which is a different change when you're out to dinner with your friends and there's who have no idea about what we've done start asking, well, I heard on the news today we've got new tariffs. This is great. Well.
So we're suddenly popular at parties like we weren't before, right?
But yeah.
I was already pretty popular.
Well, in all seriousness, in today's environment, I think the best approach is to be prepared as possible, to expect the unpredictable and know all your possible options depending on what the future may hold. From what I am seeing, there are forces pushing in both directions. You have domestic manufacturers who are obviously very pro the tariffs, and they're very loud voices. And then you have U.S. industry, exporters, importers, who also are pushing and putting pressure, saying this is not good for our business. So both sides are making quite a statement. But to answer your question, I tend to err on the side of optimism. I like to be the optimistic one. I think we're moving towards a partial repeal in the next year or two because of several reasons. One, the government is showing signs of softening on Chinese industry, and as indicated by the recent informal statements about Huawei. Two, the upcoming election, that could be very positive for us. And three, mounting pressure from U.S. industries that are being directly affected by these tariffs. And I think they're getting stronger and stronger and really showing the negative implications that they're having on our business. So from a positive side, that's my point of view.
Well, that's really useful. So for my opinion, can I have the magic 8-ball, please? No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
So I kind of like both those points of view, and I'd like to be optimistic, and when I talk to people, I'm guardedly optimistic. I see a lot of signs that the administration is sort of in this for the long haul, but I too see some signs, and I think one of the things that could have a real impact is the economy, right? The economy is what's driving a lot of things right now. It's been strong, but if we see a lot of movement that the economy is softening, that could put a lot of pressure on trade policy. And one of the things that I predicted when these duties went to 25% on list 3, these were the duties affecting a lot of consumer goods, not all of them, but I said they're really going to hit the stores, the consumer, in August. That's when they're going to filter through the supply chain. And I don't know if you noticed, but I have, certain goods are starting to get more expensive. And that's going to really be noticeable through August, through back to school, through the very, very early beginnings, I hate to say it, of Christmas, okay? But from a supply chain and retail perspective, this is where the supply chain is at. I started getting my Halloween decoration emails about a month and a half ago. So just to give you an idea of where the supply chain is. So I would like to think this is going to end soon. I'm hopeful that it ends before it has real ramifications to the economy. But I also think it's foolish to believe that the Chinese won't dig in deep and hold out for as long as they want to, because with the way their system and economy is run, they can basically dictate to the people what they're going to do in a way that you can't do here in the United States. So,
yeah, that's a good point, Robert, too, because it's once things are moving on now, but once the candle costs $25 and you feel that effect in the household, I think there's a different varying pressure that starts to come behind it too. So that'll force some change once people feel in their pockets.
Right. I mean, I don't know if people have been tracking, but I saw an article that talked about how between Section 232 and 301, there were automobile manufacturers saying that the average cost of a car could rise as much as $1,800. That's before you finance it, right? So, that's a real impact. $1,800 is a lot of money, especially to working class folks who don't have a lot. So just something to think about. So what we wanted to do is talk a little bit, since that was such a wonderful uplifting section there. We want to talk a little bit about best practices, because we think that the best way to plan is to think about what you should really be doing. And the first thing I mentioned before is review those tariff classifications. I mean, listen, that's a best practice, period, right? If you're an importer, if you're an exporter, if you're a customs broker, if you're not constantly reviewing tariff classifications, then you're not doing a good job and you're not exercising reasonable care. But it's particularly important to look closely now, because before, whereas the difference in duty might have been, I don't know, 2, 3, 4%, right? Now if you miss the target, what's the cost? 25% or more, okay? So very important to remember that tariff classification. We should really be emphasizing that internally. If you're an importer and exporter, you should be working closely with your broker. If you're a broker, You should be making sure you understand your importer and exporter and what they have, and working in partnership to get the right classifications.
Robert, I just wanted to say one thing about that too. Not every importer is going to use an attorney for these types of tariff engineering. So if an importer comes to you and you have the relationship and they're asking you and you're doing consulting, as a customs broker, you might want to consider setting up a separate company as a consultant, just to separate that liability. Because I think the lines get a little blurred there, and both those items can be covered under insurance as a transfer risk, but it's important to somebody asks you to just start answering questions, kind of know where you're at. You might want to shift your liability a little bit.
No, that's a valid point. And also make sure you're paying attention to countries of origin, right? So, once upon a time, if someone saw goods coming from Hong Kong and they didn't realize that HK was a separate country than CN, you want to make sure those kinds of mistakes aren't made. And we're going to talk about transshipment, but paying attention to countries of origin also means paying attention to that. And also with tariff engineering for both import and export, I want to emphasize, I'm not intending to leave attorneys out here. This is a place where having a lawyer, a good trade lawyer, and a lot of these things, having a good trade lawyer is worthwhile. Certainly, the worst time to engage a trade lawyer is when you hear this. Hi, it's customs, and we want to talk to you about your classification, right? So attorneys love to know that you're working with them before you get to that point. If you have something that's really complex, and remember, once upon a time, you'd lean into people for customs classification advice or other advice, and the difference again was 2, 3, 4%. The cost of an attorney never looked so reasonable against 25% duties on your product, right? And as a broker, engaging one can often be a lot cheaper than an E&O claim, right?
Love it.
Okay. So, duty drawback, which I don't know how many of you attended the duty drawback. By show of hands, how many people were in the duty drawback session? Wow, a lot of you. So you heard about duty drawback. It's a great opportunity. Now, not for Section 232, but if you're subject to Section 301 and you're exporting, maybe an FTZ is not an option for you. Duty drawback is a good way to try to get some of those duties back. And again, for a lot of companies that said, who needs duty drawback? I only got a couple $1,000s in duty. There's not a lot of companies left that are just having a couple $1,000s in duty every year now, right? So duty drawback. And also, how many people here are importers? Let me see a show of hands for importers. All right, how many of you, keep your hands up, how many of you are on periodic monthly statement? Keep your hands up. Oh, some hands went down. All right, so you can go put them down now. That's all right. I should have made them keep them up for a while to see how long they could hold it. Oh, my hand is killing me. But
You can't put your hand down until you go on ACH.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea behind periodic monthly statement is, and for the brokers in here, if you're not using it, you're missing an opportunity as well. This is a way to defer duty. It's not going to make it go away, but it gives you an opportunity because those duty impacts are huge, whether you're a broker or an importer. So getting on periodic monthly statement and pushing those duties out to the 15th business day of the following month is a great way to blunt the impact of all those import duties. All right. And Amanda did a great job talking about utilizing the ATA Carnet. Definitely make sure if you're not using it now, if you're not talking to your customers and saying, hey, have you thought about a Carnet? You should be having that conversation. Make sure that if there's an opportunity for a foreign trade zone, how much do they have to save? It's a pretty big savings before you can set it up. But if you see someone who's got an opportunity where maybe they're, just to give you an example, I had a company that set up an FTZ and they're saving $100,000 a month. Okay? I'm not going to talk about how much an FTZ costs to set up, but I promise you, $1.2 million will definitely pay for an FTZ. Okay? So just keep in mind that there's a certain threshold, but if there's a lot of money to be saved, FTZ is a valid strategy. Really look at your sourcing options. I know importers in the beginning, a lot of them played it slow. Well, this whole tariff thing, it's probably going to blow over, right? By the way, just to be clear, Magic 8 Ball never said the tariffs were going to blow over. So very consistent. Are you checking now?
No, I was just playing with it over here for a little bit.
This is why we can't have nice things, Jason. So
It's murky. It's murky.
It's murky, okay. So look at your sourcing options. A lot of companies have put this off, and now we're seeing a lot of movement. In the last 6 months, I would say a lot of importers have come forward and said we're looking at places like Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore. For textiles, we're seeing movement to Bangladesh, Pakistan, right? So people are starting to move those supply chains. We are seeing a handful of people reshoring, but I would say that's probably more the exception than the rule. Just observation, it's not a statement about opinion of what people should do. I'd love to see business come back here, but I have not seen that as a rule. So these are the best practices, the things you should be doing. So, what can go wrong? Right?
Is that Mr. Bill?
Oh no!
We're a cohesive unit up here.
Yes. All right. So see, these are some of the things that you should watch out for, right? So all the things that you can do, there's a lot of positive things you can do to strategize and look forward into the future. But remember, and someone asked me when I put invoicing schemes on the slide, they said, what's an invoicing scheme? And I said, well, if you have to ask that question, you probably know what it is, right? So these are things where you're playing games with the values, right? So another thing we haven't talked about under reasonable care is transaction value or entered value. So when the shipper or the seller starts playing games with your commercial invoice in order for you to pay less duty, or if you're a broker, if you suddenly see your customers' invoices going from, let's say, $50,000 a shipment to suddenly $5,000 a shipment for the same goods, there are some questions to be asked. Does anybody know in an audit how customs catches this? Because they know to look for what you actually paid them. Okay? You didn't pay them $5,000. They're not going to take $5,000 for $50,000 worth of goods, are they? Otherwise, you'd buy 10 times as much, right? So the key is watch your invoicing schemes, watch your transshipment, right? If your goods come in with stickers that say made in Vietnam that are curling up and underneath it says the word China, it's probably a bad sign that there's a transshipping scheme going on.
The sureties love that stuff.
Yes, I'm sure. DDP terms, and I know Sue Ross mentioned how much Customs loves DDP. A lot of bad stuff happens on DDP. Customs is right about that. And so I don't know how many of you have heard this, but importers suddenly hearing from the shipper, don't worry about it, we'll just ship it to you DDP and we'll keep the price down. Anybody see that? I see a lot of nodding heads. You think anything's going wrong there? Nah, couldn't be a problem. All right. Price reductions, sudden unexplained price reductions, and things like supplier reimbursements or credits. So you see a lot of value issues here that you should be aware of. And value is where the games that are being played are going to show up, because value is what's going to determine at 25% how much extra duty is being paid by importers. By the way, same on exporters. Ever get a buyer overseas, hey, make the invoice out for like $5,000. Hey, but the goods are worth $5 million. Don't worry about it, right? So I remember a story when I worked in New York about a company that used to sell underwater welding rods, right? Specialized equipment. I think they use it in the oil industry for oil rigs. Now, as you can imagine, underwater oil rig welding rods cannot be cheap, okay? These are not inexpensive things. They're very specialized equipment. An entire container of it that was being shipped out, container after container, value for customs was like a couple $1,000s. All right, I am not an underwater welding rod value expert, but I can tell you, at a couple $1,000s, they were totally undervalued. And the end of that story was I heard the owner of the company got a visit, and he was let out of his facility in handcuffs. So this is the kind of stuff you have to watch for. Please don't make the mistake of obliging a buyer with a low-cost invoice just so they can avoid retaliatory tariffs overseas. Go ahead, Jason.
I guess that's my cue. Importers and brokers in the room, nothing strains a relationship like thousands of dollars worth of single bond charges every month. So we'll talk about bonds a little bit, and there's another session on bonds, but that's the kind of thing that can cost a lot of money. An e-bond is great, and everything is immediate, But E-bond also has some problems because once a bond is in, if the dates are off, there's not much you can do to take that bond out. There's only certain ways around that. So it's really a big problem, and there's a lot of tools I'll talk about a little bit. But once that bond is insufficient, that's the end, and it changes the whole process. So it's definitely a serious pitfall.
Yeah, and I know you're gonna talk in a minute about some bond issues, and I think it's really important both for importers and brokers because bonds have become a huge issue over the last year. So I know there's a number of you who may have some questions, and you'll be listening very closely to what Jason has to say in a moment. Inappropriate use of tariff engineering. I think I beat that one up pretty good, so I'm not going to hit it again. And then also, Amanda, what about the foreign customs issued penalties on carnets?
So if you misuse an ATA carnet, intentionally misuse an ATA carnet, you could be exposed to a lot of fines. If you take goods into a country and you don't bring them out and you intended for them for further processing, you could be looking at the full duty plus the import tax plus a 10% penalty. And you could also get into trouble with different customs administrations for using future carnets. So if you're going to use a carnet, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. And we can talk about all the options. If you have scenarios you want to run by me, I'm more than happy to answer the scenarios and see if you qualify for a carnet. But if carnets are misused, there is foreign customs. And if you're using a carnet into the US, CBP can also charge some pretty hefty fines on misuse of an ATA carnet.
Thank you. So I know, again, the whole issue of bond sufficiency and customs bond, this has become really a hot topic. For brokers have really felt sort of a pinch as their importers have been caught with insufficient bonds and some bond increases, and there's been a lot of misunderstanding. So maybe, Jason, you could help clear up some of the issues relating to bond sufficiency so that people would have a better understanding of what the challenges are.
Thanks, Robert. We were talking before this session, about the kind of stuff we're seeing from the surety side, and we're seeing hundreds of bond increase letters come through a month, thousands total amongst all the sureties, but that's way up from where we were. So this change in tariffs has caused extreme bond increases. So the problem is that companies aren't used to providing additional information. So once that bond letter goes out, the clock starts. So there's 30 days now to comply with customs letter. What we're seeing is that initial notice that goes out isn't being addressed right away. So somebody's on vacation, somebody's out of the office, stuff is just sitting there for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then somebody's back from vacation, and now the surety is requiring financials. Because even though this has been a 15-year, 20-year customer, they haven't been paying 25% duty for all that time. They're just in that environment now. So the surety companies are going to be looking for financial viability from those importers. So it's not that we want to give you a hard time. Maybe Amanda wants to give you a hard time, not us. No, she's
no,
great.
but I think there's a good point there, which is like for a lot of brokers, you've been dealing with a lot of importers who have minimum bonds, right? $50,000 bonds. And there's never any financials for that, right, Jason? I mean, your $50,000 bond, normally there's no special underwriting requirements.
Yeah, and I can't speak for other sureties. Amanda obviously is a big surety. Generally the norm in the industry has become 50 to 100, that 100,000 range has been sort of acceptable without anything. I mean, there used to be indemnities on every bond, and importers, short form indemnities that importers would sign. That's kind of gone away too. So there's been this sort of smooth process that nobody's felt anything. And, now when we're getting into these higher limit bonds, sureties have our own underwriting files to protect. So if something goes wrong and an importer is insolvent, there's a demand on surety, and we only have a certain amount of time to pay. So we also have people to answer to as well. So we're given authority to write bonds, but then we have to go show that underwriting file. And we have to show that we've looked at financials, we understand the commodities involved, and we understand those things. So that's sort of where I think things get a little bit of a hitch. So it's the key from my perspective is that the sureties are sending out letters, address them right away. Also, a big thing is be proactive. I mean, the system for determining bond amounts hasn't changed. It's still 10% of estimated duties, taxes, and fees from the prior 12 months. But what customs is saying is start forecasting these things. Like, look forward at what you are going to be importing so that we can avoid having to keep increasing the bond every month. I mean, at IB&M, we've seen the same bond being increased every 2 months.
Well, and just to reiterate, because it's always a 12-month look back, and those 301 duties went into effect, and each month that they were in effect, the duty looked in the 12-month look back was looking higher and higher, and that's why these bonds kept jumping up.
Right.
So it's really important. I agree with you, Jason. I think you should be helping your clients look forward. If you're a broker, if you're an importer, you shouldn't be relying on the past. You should be looking forward. What do I expect to bring in, and what do I expect my duty to be? And you won't keep getting these increases because there's other issues related to those constant increases.
It might not just be the cost of the bond. The bond cost isn't the big thing. There are going to be times when sureties require collateral, partial collateral, full collateral. So if you're increasing 3 times, that's what they're calling stacking liability. Okay, there's open items. The surety is liable for all those terms. Okay, and you may have to post collateral for multiple terms. So it might not hurt that you have to pay a few $100s or a few $1,000s for a bond, but it might hurt if you have to post and tie up cash $600,000, $800,000 3 times. So now you've got $1.8 million tied up. And for some of these importers, it's very tough to manage that. And customs brokers in the room, they have tools to monitor bond sufficiency. So you could be proactive with your importer and get ahead of it. I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit for a minute about transferring risk, but one thing that an importer who goes direct to a marketing company for a bond can't transfer that risk like they can to a customs broker. If you're using a customs broker, they have tools to monitor your bond and to get ahead of it. They can make live updates in ACE through ABI system to name changes and address changes. These are things that are important. So we're here obviously advocates of the customs brokerage community, but it's important, we feel, to have a licensed customs broker handling your bond for those reasons alone. We were involved at IB&M specifically with a case where an importer went to a direct marketing company. The bond became insufficient. This importer was rather large, so they had to do like 20 or 30 single bonds a day. So that direct marketing company had to go and then pay for the cost of all those single bonds. Plus, it added all kinds of other problems. So we always say that use those tools, those sufficiency monitoring tools if you're a broker. And if you're an importer, use a licensed customs broker for your bond. They know what they're doing, and they're the best people to handle it. So yeah, I pretty much just talked through all my slides, zigzagged all around. So yeah, we covered stacking liability, monitoring. Yeah, and like I said, it's the high limit bonds that trigger the underwriting. So it's bonds are here, and then when they get to a certain level, that's where the sureties are going to be looking for additional information.
Right, and Section 301 and 232 means that if you have an importer that's got reasonable volumes and they're impacted, which is a lot of importers, they're probably going to end up in a different category for your surety for the bond, where they're going to need at least to see financials. Right. And for companies that, again, you've been doing business as a broker maybe for 20 years with an importer, or as an importer, you may be doing business with a broker for 20 years. And the problem is that all of a sudden we're seeing these gigantic increases, and the importers are getting squeezed. I don't know how many of you here that are importers are getting squeezed, but on the selling side, your customers don't want to pay the extra, right? And you feel you're in a competitive market and you cannot raise your prices the 25% or 22% or 18% that will help offset those Section 301 duties. But you still have to pay them, right? So as an importer, you're feeling that squeeze. As brokers and as sureties, we understand suddenly a customer who we've dealt with for 20 years and never had cash flow issues is suddenly getting cash crunched. So we're not worried that you're all going to go belly up, but it's a sudden risk that didn't exist a year ago. Right. So you should be aware. And the company that's absorbing that risk is the surety.
Right. And it's key. Look, it's all about relationships. So all the sureties represented here, we're in the business of writing bonds. We're not in the business of rejecting bonds. But we have to go through the process. We have to talk through these situations. We have to be able to communicate, here's why we're asking for what we're asking, because I think we are seeing a lot of, sometimes there's hostile situations where it's like you never asked for this before and now you're asking for it. But just communicate and work with your surety, and we'll talk to you and we'll try to identify why we're asking for what we're asking. So you could talk to your importing client and deal with it, each item. Okay, I just got the 2-minute mark. 2 minutes for the ball or 2 minutes for me? The ball's done.
The Magic 8 Ball is much more interesting, don't you think?
I got a better head of hair. Anyway, yeah, no, I'll just touch real quick on insurance. We're talking about mitigating factors here. I mean, insurance is one vehicle to reduce exposure. It's the equitable transfer of risk from one party to another. So, there are ways to protect yourself here. If you're buying a house, obviously you transfer some of that responsibility to your real estate attorney, title insurance. You're transferring that risk to them, so you don't have to deal with it. And it's the same thing with insurance here. So, brokers in the room, it's a changing environment. E&O insurance and professional liability insurance is important to have. It's there to protect you. The risk managers in the room who are hiring subcontractors, it's important for you to get evidence of that insurance from your subcontractors and keep it on file to a level that that's acceptable to you. So these are transfer tools that amidst this crazy time, you're able to reduce some of the exposure because things are happening fast. Is that the 1 minute warning? I don't know.
I think they're threatening the trap door here. They're going to drop us right through.
A couple other things. I mean, cargo owners in the room, fluctuations to your inventory, foreign trade zones. Are you changing the way your supply chain works? Understand your inventory. Let your insurance broker know that you no longer have $20 million in a warehouse somewhere. That can affect your premiums. Your broker needs to know. It could save you money. On the import side, you can insure your duties as well. So if your duties have gone from $100,000 to $800,000, you need to account for that so you could be made whole again. And something a lot of people don't know is duty is traditionally at 1/3 the rate of your normal marine rate to insure. So if you're paying 30 cents, the duty is only going to cost you 10 cents to insure. So that's another thing to discuss with your insurance broker, or if you're working with a freight forwarder for your insurance, let them know that. And review your own policy. Stuff like carrier insolvency, freightage is down, things are tightening up. Like some things might not be, there's fine print on your policy. Some things you might not know you need covered, and every policy is different is what I'm saying. So it's a time maybe to review your insurance if you're a risk manager. So yeah, I think that's all I had. So I'm good. Thanks, Robert.
All right. So at this point, we hopefully have given you some thoughts on strategies, things you can do, some opportunities, some things you should be looking at more closely, things you should be aware of. And we would love to entertain your questions now. I'm sure there's lots of questions, so we're going to be here for the next little while, and maybe we can give one of those microphones to Kiko, and he can run it around the room. And if you have questions, just raise your hand, and we'll do the best we can to answer whatever questions you have.